The Mind's Eye with BJ Turnov is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, and all major platforms. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the Mind's Eye. You are now standing at the intersection of history and mystery, science and the strange, and crime and the sublime. I'm DJ BJ Turnov, humble host of this auditorium of audacity. If you've ever said or been tongue-tied, God, I know I've been so many times on this show, as you know, hoodwinked, in a pickle, or on a wild goose chase, well, then you, sir or ma'am, you have been Shakespeared. Those are just some of the few terms that he's made up. The man really had a way with words, and there is a reason why he is considered one of the greatest literary geniuses. Like many of the listeners here, you were probably forced to read, listen, or watch some incarnation of Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, or, whatever classic your English teacher got off on. What I don't really remember is being taught much about the man himself. When you start to dig into his biography, you quickly start to realize how most of his personal life is a complete mystery. Even the most ardent academic Shakespeare scholars agree that there are no birth or school records. Most of his 20s, they don't know what he was doing. It's considered his lost years. You can't officially date his plays because no original manuscripts exist. His portrait was only commissioned after his death. Hell, they don't even know what he died from. What if the reason why there's so little documentation or proof of Shakespeare is because, well, he didn't exist at all, or at least in the incarnation that we know him as? My guest, author Katherine Chilean, she has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for nearly 3 decades. Her research indicates that the bard was not the man from Stratford, who he's been historically associated with, but someone completely different using a pen name. These two very different men were then merged into one identity, and it wasn't by accident. Katherine's going to spill the beans from the evidence that she's collected. It's in her book, Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Work. That's exactly what you're going to get when The Mind's Eye returns. Appreciate you sticking around for The Mind's Eye. Not only did Shakespeare produce some of the best acting material of all time, he also had a big hand in creating the first set of A-list actors. The King's Men, the acting troupe who performed the Bard's plays, they definitely have their own legendary stories, but I'm not even sure that they can top this recently confirmed outrageous rumor from Hollywood history, and I absolutely love it. The Bundy Drive Boys, comprised of Errol Flynn, W.C. Fields, and John Barrymore, amongst other A-list actors of that time, and yes, that is the same Barrymore, the grandfather of Drew Barrymore. Well, the Bundy Drive Boys, they had their own reputation for mischief and hijinkses. Supposedly, after John Barrymore's death in 1942, they smuggled their friend out of the morgue for one final toast. Aw, isn't that so nice? And my friends, by the way, I totally give you permission for that. And you're never going to believe who actually did confirm that Hollywood rumor as true. Find out who by rolling over to Twitter and Facebook at Mind's Eye Show, or go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. Stick around because Katherine Chilean's going to unmask Shakespeare for who he really is, back in a Mind's Eye moment. We welcome Katherine Chilean to the show right now, independent Shakespeare scholar, independent as independent thinker. Katherine, how art thou?
I am lovely, thank you.
Excellent. So I guess I'll do a little bit of my background, and then I want to hear all about yours, just with Shakespeare. I enjoyed the couple Shakespeare play that we were kind of forced to read in high school. Although I haven't really touched this stuff since then. I would like to imagine I'd have a pretty greater appreciation now, but in researching for this interview, I assumed that for someone so famous who lived relatively recently, you think there'd be lots of biographical info on him. So it's interesting when you kind of start digging in, you quickly realize how little actual documentation exists. My point is that I'm not really tied to him historically or emotionally, so I'm open to viewing him in whatever prism. that's kind of my Shakespeare background. How did you get into the playwright and really down the road that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare?
Well, I come from a similar background too. I read Romeo and Juliet in 10th grade, and my 10th grade English teacher mentioned that some people think Shakespeare was Christopher Marlowe. And I knew nothing about this, so I thought that was an odd statement. But that's all she said. And then a few years later, I noticed a debate about this topic of the Shakespeare authorship on TV. So I watched it, and like you, I was unbiased. I didn't know anything about it. And I saw the person representing the traditional view, which was an English professor from an Ivy League college. And he was debating a man who had recently written a book called The Mysterious William Shakespeare, Charlton Ogburn, a wonderful book, by the way. And he was saying it wasn't the traditional Shakespeare. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford, a nobleman. And I just saw him spouting off fact after fact after fact and making his case. And, you know, the Shakespeare professor, he couldn't support his own candidate. And I thought that was a strange situation. In fact, beyond that, he just basically cast aspersions on Charlton Ogburn, you know, saying, oh, yeah, that's a nice mystery story, you know, but, you know, there's nothing true to it. And, you know, he just put it down without defending his own man. And that's when I read the book, and I've just been kind of turned on ever since. It's very, very important to me because we're talking about one of the titans of Western civilization. And I think it's time that we all know who he really was.
And just listening to you, I mean, you sound like you're into Shakespeare. And a lot of times people who are proponents of, you know, the theory that the Stratford William Shakespeare who's associated with him isn't that Shakespeare, they're actually labeled as anti-Shakespeare. I mean, how do you feel about a label like that?
Yeah, it's not a pleasant label. We're really pro Earl of Oxford. But yes, it is a true description. We are against the man born in Stratford-upon-Avon as being the true author of the plays. He was not, simply because there's no lifetime evidence to support that. So actually, the Shakespeare professor is really a proponent of a theory. And, you know, we're not the theory makers, they are. And so the book that I wrote, I wanted to know what made, English professors so confident in their man without questioning it. Here I am, unbiased. I know nothing about this, right? And I see something odd going on. If my topic was Shakespeare or, you know, great English, I would want to look into it just to see what's going on. But they don't seem to want to do that. They just are happy with the traditional story. And that's the reason why I went into my book is, you know, what makes them so confident. And all you have to do is look at the lifetime evidence, and you can see they don't have any. But if you look at the posthumous evidence, the evidence after the Stratford man had died, that's where you can see their confidence. But really, which is more important, the lifetime evidence or the posthumous evidence? I would say most people would say the lifetime.
And the book that she's referencing that she wrote is called Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. Again, that's Katherine Chilean. And some of the evidence that you're talking about, or really kind of the lack of evidence for William Shakespeare, is that, for the listener who, you know, is kind of a layman like me, is that, and this is what academic Shakespeare scholars kind of all agree on, that there's no birth or school records. Most of his 20s is considered his lost years. No one knows what this Stratford Shakespeare was doing. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, his plays can't be dated because there's no manuscripts or poems. His portrait was only commissioned after his death. We don't even know how he died. Shakespeare doesn't really leave much of a paper trail, or at least the Stratford Shakespeare that they're talking about. At least kind of go into some of the documents that this supposed Stratford Shakespeare, who's associated as William Shakespeare, the playwright, what is that surviving documents?
Yes, no, you summarized it beautifully. Everything you said was correct. We don't have an authentic image of him. You know, when it was made in his lifetime, we don't have any evidence he went to school. We don't have any letters in his handwriting. We don't have any manuscripts. We don't have payments to him as a writer. And especially his dying. When he died, no one said a word. And yet every other writer of significance during this period, we're talking 16th century and 17th century, always within a year, someone would mention it either in print or in a letter or in some way. Not so for the great author supposedly the Stratford men, when he died in 1616. It was complete silence. Nothing was said for 7 years. Okay, you want to know what we do know about the Stratford man?
Please do.
He was christened. He was married. We have those records. His children were christened. His father applied for a coat of arms, which was eventually granted. So he had a coat of arms. He is on lists for owing taxes. We know that he was a moneylender, and we know that he bought theater shares. I mean, that he did have an association with the theater. And he was one of 3 people allowed to be given money, to receive money on behalf of a play performance, a performance before the Queen. And so he was one of 3 people to receive payment. So that's about all the nuggets we have during his lifetime. Those are actually the nice things that we have about him. We have some negative things as well. For example, he and 2 other people had a restraining order put against them for, being threatening their lives. So he was one of the people, in the restraining order. He's also on record for hoarding grain in time of famine. His name is on a list. So those are, the negative. There are other things. He wanted to enclose lands, taking it away from the public. He wanted to make it private, which the people were against. This is in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. So again, I don't mean to put him down. There's something very important to be said about him, in that he and his family, neither of them claimed to be the great author William Shakespeare. He just had a similar name. And what it boils down to is there were 2 William Shakespeares of this period. There was the one we've been talking about, who was truly involved in theater in a business capacity, right? In my opinion, that's what, to me, connecting the dots.
Were those theaters and acting companies that Stratford William Shakespeare, were those associated with any actual Shakespeare related theaters and acting companies?
Yes. The Globe Theater. He was a founding member for theater shares of that. And then a little bit later, he got shares in a more private upper class theater called the Blackfriars Theater. So
that seems like a kind of a big coincidence of sorts. The person that they say is William Shakespeare had shares in the same Shakespeare, theater.
Yeah, and Shakespeare plays were performed there at the Globe. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. I'm not denying him that at all. But the problem is we don't have lifetime evidence of him having any form of education or no evidence of writing, you see. Those are the most important things of all, right? And, when you think about this period, none of his letters survived, supposedly, right? Well, yes, it was 400 years ago, but private letters have survived since then. And notebooks have survived. Manuscripts of plays have survived.
What about someone like his... No, I apologize. I was going to say, what about someone like a contemporary of his and the person who wrote the foreword to the first folio, I believe, yes. Ben Jonson. Johnson, when he died, kind of what paper trail did he leave, and was his life celebrated?
Yes. Well, first of all, he did leave behind in his own handwriting a portion of something like a play. It's called a mask. It's a form of a play. So we have things in his handwriting. Mm. We have letters. We have some of the books that he owned exist. We know that. And when he died, oh, you can't believe the tributes. There are 3-4 books full of poems and tributes to Ben Jonson because he was so respected and so famous during this time. Shakespeare was equally as famous and respected during his lifetime, and yet not a word when he died in 1616. Nothing. It took 7 years when, like you mentioned, the opening of Shakespeare's 36 Shakespeare plays, a book of them, appeared in 1623. So Ben Jonson is a great example for what we should know. We know all sorts of things about Ben Jonson, his literary life and his private life. We know stuff, but nothing about the great author William Shakespeare, which is why so much of the plays and especially the sonnets are a mystery. The sonnets that he wrote were very intimate, all written in the first person, and yet they don't seem to describe somebody of the Stratford man's background. And like a good example would be sonnets, I believe it was sonnet 125, where he says, "Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, with my extern the outward honoring." So he is saying, was it anything to me that I bore the canopy? Now that could only be a reference to holding a canopy over Queen Elizabeth. 4 people would hold it. Now to be one of those people, to have the privilege of carrying the canopy over the Queen, you had to have someone who was either highly ranked or an official of some sort. You had to be a special person. And here the great author is saying, did it mean anything to me that I carried it? Now that sounds like a bored courtier. It doesn't sound like somebody who was given a great honor who came from humble origins. So that's just one example.
Or someone who was kind of forced to do it, knowing that, if he didn't, he'd probably be a great disrespect to the Queen. Stratford Shakespeare, now, he wasn't an educated man, but to be a moneylender that you think he would have to be educated, right?
Well, I mean, keeping accounts.
You're keeping books, so you'd have to be
keeping books. Well, maybe he was, had a certain a level of intelligence. I'm not saying he's stupid, but he wasn't the person who wrote the works. That is a totally different thing. If you look at the plays, they tell us quite a bit about the great author. In fact, that is how in 1920 our theory that the Earl of Oxford was a great author was founded by J. Thomas Loney. This is the 100th anniversary we're celebrating this year. He made a list of what the great author had to have been and known, including having a classical education. And if you look at the works, he knew things like rhetoric, he knew Latin, he knew Greek, he knew French and Italian languages, he knew the aristocracy, their language and their customs. He knew musical terms, astronomy, medicine, over 600 references to medicine. He knew the law. I mean, it was like an unending, cornucopia of intelligence and education, history of all sorts. Now, these type of things were not taught at the local grammar school, which is what the Shakespeare, expert would tell you. Oh yeah, he got a really, high education, even though he went to school until he was maybe 13 or 14. I mean, we don't know. We can't say for sure that the Stratford men went to the local grammar school because there's no records of that period. They haven't survived. But certainly things like astronomy and ancient Greek, rhetoric, which was only taught at the university level, or the law, which you had to go to special law schools to learn. Certainly that's not taught at the local grammar school. And we even have the records, the university records of this period, and the law school records, and there's no William Shakespeare in there. So it's a big zero. So everywhere you would expect to find him, you don't. And really, the best way to explain this paradox is that the name was really a pen name, William Shakespeare. And the name Shakespeare is, if you look at the first word, it's shake and spear shaking. So, and half the time that the name was printed, it had a hyphen between the two. So that's a descriptive name. And printers probably believed that the name was a made-up name. So that's why they put the hyphen in between. So a spear shaker, and that was a term that was used in the 16th century of spear shaking. It was another term for a jouster, someone who used a spear in a tournament, a long spear. And just coincidentally, the Earl of Oxford, who was my candidate for the great author, he was a champion at the joust. He won 2 tournaments, so that was certainly applicable to him.
Yeah, I found that really interesting that the name William Shakespeare, when it is signed, it's not even actually the name William Shakespeare. It's different forms of it and shorthand versions of it. So that one kind of really stuck out to me.
Yeah,
that the name William Shakespeare is kind of even made up in itself, or not made up. It's William Shakespeare doesn't even use the name William Shakespeare.
Well, if you look at the contemporary documents for the Stratford man, where he's, listed, the name was spelled phonetically, and it sounded like Shakespeare, Shackspere. That's one spelling. Shaxper, the short A. So Shakespeare. That's, and he was not writing these. Other people were writing them, right? Clerks were writing his name down. So they were writing it phonetically. It was never spelled. Maybe in 1 or 2 instances was the name spelled as we know it. Shakespeare. But the majority of cases, it was spelled with a short A. And that's the way his father spelled it, too. So, there were other people with the name William Shakespeare as well. I found in my research in 1605, there was a William Shakespeare, and he was in the army. He was listed in the army.
And that's completely unrelated to the Stratford Shakespeare.
Well, yeah, they lived in the same county, which was Warwickshire, but they're 2 different men, because no Shakespeare professor will tell you he's in the army in 1605. In 1603, the name William Shakespeare turns up in a list for the King's Men Acting Company. That was when the new King James got on the throne, and he got his own acting troupe together, and the name William Shakespeare was on that. I think it was the Stratford man, but again, I think it was in the capacity as a financier, somebody who fronted money to put on the play performances, because it appears that they would be paid after the fact. So if you were going to give a nice performance before a royal, obviously you're going to have some nice props and nice costumes. Well, who's going to pay for that in advance? That's my idea of really what his role was. I don't think he really was an actor, because we don't have any proof or know what he acted in. It's a big blank. If you look at his contemporary, a great big actor, his name was Edward Allen. He was probably the first superstar actor of the period. And we know what roles he played. He played in Tamburlaine the Great, which was a play by Christopher Marlowe. We have a lot of his relics, and we even have parts of plays that he annotated as he's learning them. So we have all sorts of things left behind. And he was a producer as well, a theater producer with his in-law. So again, everything is blank for the Stratford man in comparison with others.
And before you mention who you think you're going to throw your hat into the ring, and for who you think the real William Shakespeare is, so let's just let's just stop right there for a moment, hit a commercial break, and then we'll go into who you really think it is. This is Katherine Chilean speaking with The Mind's Eye. We'll be right back. Appreciate you sticking around. We are talking with Katherine Chilean about her book, Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Work. Shakespeare wrote that we know what we are, but know not what we may be. And I think Katherine Chilean is going to tell us who Shakespeare really was. All right, so tell us, you told us the name before. Why don't you say it again and a little bit about why you think this person was the real William Shakespeare?
Well, yes, the true author was Edward de Vere. He was a nobleman. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford. And he was born in 1550, and he died in 1604. And he was highly educated. He had tutors when he was quite young. And at the age of 8, he was admitted to Cambridge University. They did go to university early back then, but that was really early. Okay. So he had obviously was at the prodigy level, I would say. And when he was 16, he went to Oxford University, or actually after Cambridge, he went to Oxford. And when he was 16, he graduated from there and had his master's degree. And from there, he went on to law school, a place called Gray's Inn, and law. They call them law societies, and they learned the law. Those inns of court also happened to be nice theater places, so I'm sure he had something to do with the theater at that point. Then a few years later, he married, and he married the daughter of the most powerful man in England, Lord Burleigh. In fact, he was ennobled, so his daughter would be, allowed to marry him because she had no status. So he is connected with the most powerful man in England. He actually lived in his house before that time because the Earl of Oxford's father, the 16th Earl, died when he was 12. So in that period, if that happened, you had to become a ward of the state. He became a ward of Queen Elizabeth, and she had him live in Lord Burleigh's house. So he was right up from the very start exposed to very high-level people and politics, all sorts of politics. After his marriage to his daughter, he took a grand tour of Europe. He was gone for almost a year and a half. He spent the most amount of time in Italy. And as you may know, many of the Shakespeare plays take place in Italy. He loved Italy. And, it's a perfect parallel. And in fact, one of our members, Oxfordian members, he recently passed away, Richard Rowe. He wrote a wonderful book called The Shakespeare Guide to Italy in 2011. And he had spent many years of his life looking at the kind of incidental references to places in Italian towns. And he said, I'm going to go and see if such things exist. And, one after the next, things that you wouldn't, find in a guidebook were things that that Shakespeare mentioned in the plays. So it truly is evidence that the great author visited Italy. And we know the Earl of Oxford was there a long time, certainly to remember all this. And of course, the Stratford man, there is absolutely no evidence he even ever left England. So anyway, this is just to show you the breadth of the Earl of Oxford's learning, experience, education. And it's a perfect fit. I mean, the numerous topics that Shakespeare knew is accounted for in the education of the Earl of Oxford. And a great life parallel is when the Earl of Oxford was coming back from his grand tour of Europe. He was taking a boat across the English Channel. Well, the boat was attacked by pirates. He lost everything, and they stripped him to his underclothes, and he almost lost his life. Well, just so happens that Hamlet, the same thing happened to Prince Hamlet. He was in a boat and pirates attacked him and almost killed him. It's a perfect parallel. But then if you look deeper into Hamlet, who Hamlet was, and Hamlet is what most Shakespeare scholars will tell you is, probably the most autobiographical because it's so intimate. But Hamlet was a university student, a nobleman, a courtier, a traveler. He killed someone. He patronized an acting company. He loved the daughter of the king's minister. All of this fits the Earl of Oxford. It's a portrait of himself. And there are other portraits also in the plays, like Bertram in All's Well That Ends Well. It starts out with him saying that he is a ward of the court, which was, as I mentioned, the Earl of Oxford he was underage when his father died, and he became a ward of the court. So it's just another parallel right there. And the parallels just keep building. And especially, you can even see it in the sonnets. He wrote 150 poems called sonnets that were very intimate. And in them, most of the sonnets are about a fair young man, a beautiful young man. We call him the fair youth. And most Shakespeare scholars will tell you that that person was the Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley. Well, it just so happens the Earl of Oxford had 3 daughters, and one of them almost married the Earl of Southampton. They were trying to arrange that match. It didn't work. So there's a connection right there. Another great connection with the sonnets is he was obsessed with a lady with dark hair and eyes. We call her the Dark Lady, right? Well, the Earl of Oxford was also obsessed with a dark lady. Her name was Anne Vavasor. And when the Earl of Oxford came back from his European trip, he had information that his child was born later than he was told, and that in essence that his wife was unfaithful, and he just completely separated himself from her without even talking to her about it. That was it. And during their estrangement, he fell in love with this dark-haired attendant of Queen Elizabeth, and they had a child together. And when the Queen found out, they were both thrown in the tower. But I mean, he was, in love with her for, several years until he was forced to separate from her and go back to his wife, the Queen. The Queen made it happen. So, it's just parallel after parallel, and it's so interesting. And it makes, when you have a real biography to look at, which the Earl of Oxford's is so incredible, it makes the plays come alive and makes your understanding of them come alive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. With the Earl of Oxford, with his personal writings, were there any similarities to the plays and the works of Shakespeare? Has anyone ever done an analysis of that of sorts?
Yes, a book was made on the parallel phrasing. It's kind of a thick book, but yes, I don't have any examples to tell you. But yes, a whole book was written in that with that topic in mind.
And what about his? Oh no, I apologize. And what were you going to say?
Go ahead.
No. I was going to say, and what about his family? Did anyone of them actually know that he was the real Shakespeare?
Well, I think they did. In 1623, which was about 19 years after the Earl of Oxford died, and 7 years after the Stratford man died, a book of Shakespeare plays was published. We call it today the First Folio, Shakespeare's First Folio. 36 Shakespeare plays, and there are opening pages in that book. One of the opening pages is a letter to the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Montgomery. The Earl of Montgomery was Oxford's son-in-law. So there was definitely a family connection there. But the irony is, or the strangeness is, that this book attempted to put the authorship on the man with a similar name, the Stratford man. So this in-law was certainly aware of it and was, I think, part of the people who wanted this to happen. Now, we don't know what the exact reason is, but it was an injustice. On one hand, it was a great honor to have all those plays printed in one book. If this book hadn't been printed, we wouldn't have had 20 Shakespeare plays. They would have been lost. Plays like Macbeth and The Tempest. Many of those works were not printed before. So on one hand, it was wonderful. On the other hand, they did an injustice to the great author. And it seemed that the great author was aware that this was going to happen. If you look at his sonnets, and he is speaking to the fair youth, this young man, and he says to him, "From hence your memory death cannot take, although in me each part will be forgotten. Your name," meaning the young man, "your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I, once gone, to all the world must die." So he's saying that his name is going to live forever, this young man, but not his own name. Now, how do you explain that? I would say that he's referring to two poems that he dedicated to the young man who was, almost everyone believes, the third Earl of Southampton. This occurred in 1593 on his poem called Venus and Adonis. And he wrote a dedication to the Earl of Southampton, and he signed it William Shakespeare. So, and then a year later, another poem with the same thing, dedicated to the Earl of Southampton, signed William Shakespeare. Those, as long as the name Shakespeare lives, so will the Earl of Southampton, because his name is on his book. But why wasn't it the case for the great author? Because it's his pen name that is going to live forever, not his actual name, Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. So he is somewhat lamenting this. So he knew something was going to happen after his death.
So why wouldn't the real Shakespeare, Earl of Oxford, say something and say, "Hey, no, I'm the real Shakespeare," even on his deathbed?
Yes. Well, during his lifetime, he wouldn't have wanted that to be known because of his high status. It was a social convention back then. If you were writing poetry or even the theater, oh my God, that was very low déclassé. It was something you didn't want people to know about. After death, however, it was also a social convention that it would be okay for your works to be printed and with your name on them. But that didn't happen for the Earl of Oxford. Why it didn't happen, it's a mystery. It's really the whole key to the authorship problem. The last two chapters of my book, I give my explanation as to why. I think it has something to do with the sonnets and also some of the plays, the Shakespeare plays, like, for example, Hamlet, we mentioned. The minister in the play, his name is Polonius. He's the king's minister. Historians have long believed that this was actually a parody or lampooning of Queen Elizabeth's minister, Lord Burleigh, who we've mentioned before. So it was not a flattering portrayal. If it were known that the Earl of Oxford was the great author, they would say, "Oh, this has to be a portrait of Lord Burleigh in Polonius." People would make the connection. The same thing with Lord Burleigh's son, Robert Cecil. Many people of the period linked him to Shakespeare's play of Richard III, the hunchback Richard III. Well, Robert Cecil also had a curvature of the spine too. So, and people of the period associated the two. Now, if people of the period knew that the Earl of Oxford was writing, then they would say, "Oh, he was writing about this guy, Robert Cecil." and he was greatly involved in the government too. So it was also kind of a political protection. The family didn't want posterity to know that they were being lampooned. Those are just a couple cases. So I think there's a few reasons why they needed to cover it up. But hey, it's been 400 years now. I think it's time for it to come out.
Yeah, the people behind the first folio, they're called friends and business associates of Shakespeare. Why would they perpetrate this hoax, and why wouldn't they reclaim it for the Earl of Oxford?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the opening pages, the prefatory pages, about 16 pages, it opens with a dedication to the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, and it's signed by two actors, Hemmings. One man was Hemmings, and the other Condell, Hemmings and Condell. And they wrote a letter to these people, and they also wrote a letter to the reader. So two different letters. Well, people would say, oh, they were buddies, and the great author was, just one of his buddies, just somebody of the same background. Well, it turns out that they did not write these letters. They were written by Ben Jonson, who was also one of the contributors. So right off the bat, you have, a falsehood being perpetrated that the great author was a friend and fellow of these actors. And also, if you look at the image of Shakespeare, that famous black and white image, it's just a gentleman, basically a picture of a gentleman. It's not someone that you would think of as a poet, because he's not holding laurel leaves or wearing laurel leaves on his head. That was a sign of poetic victory for writers. And even Jonson says, don't look at this image, look at his book. So that's a kind of an intriguing thing going on. So I think that Jonson, who was the protege of the Earl of Pembroke, who was one of the people who the book was dedicated to, I think that he was in his pay and doing what he wanted. So I think ultimately the Earl of Pembroke is responsible for projecting this false image that the great author was from Stratford and had humble origins. He was not a nobleman. And
he did that to help his friend to cover up his his political shade throwing.
Yes. I think for the Cecil family and for other people who may be important people who were satirized in the works. But I think that, and this is what I get into in my book, I think really the Shakespeare's sonnets, which were so personal, they reveal, if you read them in the right manner, they reveal that the fair youth that the great author loved was actually a child of Queen Elizabeth. So this may have had something to do with the succession. And the Earl of Pembroke, who sponsored this book, was greatly benefited by King James, who succeeded Queen Elizabeth. But a few years after, into his reign, a lot of the nobility were not happy with King James. And it could be that people may have thought, oh, well, did the Queen have a child? It looks like Shakespeare was alluding to a child of the Queen. Who is this person? Maybe we can, put him on the throne. This is just, again, this is speculation. It's just reading a version of the sonnets. And that could have been the reason why, because the sonnets were published in 1609. And it was shortly after that the Earl of Pembroke wanted to become the Lord Chamberlain. And if you become the Lord Chamberlain, you can control anything having to do with the theater and theater publishing. So he really wanted that post. And as soon as he did get the post, He promoted Ben Jonson with an annuity. He got it from the Crown, £66 a year, and also suddenly Shakespeare publication stopped for 2 years. So it's very interesting, and I do cover this in the book, what was going on. But despite all this, we do have to be grateful to the Earl of Pembroke and Montgomery for publishing this work, which was a huge expense. It was over 900 very large pages, printed on pretty nice paper. So we do have to be grateful for him.
And you mentioned before that that the Earl of Oxford's family may have known that he really was the real Shakespeare. I mean, have any of them alluded to it ever since, in any point in their family lineage? And side question, anyone in their family lineage ever became, a huge writer, playwright or something of that ilk?
No. But in the 20th century, one of his collateral descendants, he went on, he has written a book called Shakespeare's Lost Kingdom, and he did give many lectures about this topic. Yes, but this is 400 years later. So, nobody said it. In fact, the Earl of Oxford had, several children. None of them named their child Edward, which is interesting. And
why would you say that'd be interesting?
I don't know. It's kind of unusual that they didn't. They named them Vere as a first name, but not Edward. So that's kind of a curious thing. It could also be because the Earl of Oxford's daughters, he had 3 daughters, like King Lear, they were raised by their grandfather more than their father. So they were perhaps protective of their grandfather, who was Lord Burleigh, the one that I was saying was lampooned as Polonius in Hamlet. So it could be that they wanted, to absent their father's name from these works.
Did the Stratford Shakespeare, who's associated as the playwright, and the nobleman, the real one, did they ever meet somewhere?
That's a wonderful question. I think the Earl of Oxford knew who he was, the Stratford man, because he, in my opinion, if you read it correctly, and this is one of the chapters of my book, he did include him as a character in a few of his plays. In one of them, he was named William. So, that's certainly something to look into. I think the Earl of Oxford didn't know who he was, but I don't know if the Stratford man knew who the Earl of Oxford was. I mean, it's possible. It's interesting, the Earl of Oxford's widow, in her will, she left money to my dumb man, D-U-M-B, my dumb man. Some people think perhaps that was the Stratford man, that he was being paid. I don't know. I don't know that for sure. But it could be that they paid him off. He was confusing people, and they sent him back to Stratford-upon-Avon. I mean, when he did go back to living there, he did buy a lot of property. But keep in mind that in 1640, people were not allowed to talk to this. We know about this because somebody published, and it was an anonymous person. He published a book about a bunch of epigrams, and one of them was to William Shakespeare. And he said, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." Why? Why, many years after the Stratford man had died, and the Earl of Oxford as well. And also in 1640, a book of Shakespeare's poems came out, and it had a similar image as the one in the first folio. And there was a little bit of verse underneath it, and it said, "This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's, soul of the age?" Yeah, these question marks saying this picture in the folio, this really is Shakespeare? So there were people who were questioning it, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. And, you get these indirect and cryptic references about what's going on. And I collected a lot of them, and they're in my book. So people did know about it, but they were not inspired to talk about it.
And a lot of mysteries lingering on, and one of those is that we don't know how Shakespeare died. I mean, can you at least tell us how the Earl of Oxford died?
Well, yeah, we actually don't know for sure. It was said that he had the plague, but there was no plague in that year. So yes, I don't know for sure. There is a mystery about how he died, and unfortunately we don't know where he's buried either. He was buried near his home in Hackney, which is back then was the outskirts of London. But they tore down the church that he was buried in. It was also said by one of his relations, not too long after he died, that his body was removed to Westminster Abbey. So that's a possibility too, that it's there in an unmarked grave. We don't know.
Before I let you go, where do you think you're going to be focusing on for this next? Anything particular, like the handwriting analysis? Where is this leading you?
Well, I'm on the moment working on a book involving Shakespeare and the art world. So as soon as this lockdown can be over and I can get back into the libraries, I can try to finish it. But the organization that I'm part of is having an open conference that anyone can join. Just go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, and October 2nd, which is coming up, October 2nd and 3rd, several Oxfordians like me will be giving talks. I'll be giving it on the 3rd, and your listeners can get an idea of what we're about and what's going on in the movement. Just go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, and you can register for free to our symposium.
Well, I think I just might myself, actually, quite frankly.
Okay.
And what about you? Do you have any personal websites?
I have one. It's my book title, ShakespeareSuppressed.com, and you can contact me there. You can purchase a book through there or on Amazon.
And I highly recommend that you do. I know that you think Katherine completely unmasked Shakespeare, but there's a lot more to that story. Definitely grab your hands on the book. That's Shakespeare Suppressed, the uncensored truth about Shakespeare and his work. Katherine Chilean, thank you so much for your time, and fare thee well.
I thank thee, as Shakespeare would say.
Mind's Eye wrap-up when we come back. Mind's Eye wrap-up time. Personally, I think Katherine put up a pretty good argument. I mean, after all, she has debated the topic at the Smithsonian Institution. I'm not necessarily 100% convinced, but I also don't really have any strong feelings either way on the topic. Regardless whether Shakespeare was the man from Stratford, Edward de Vere, or someone else, much of his life is still going to remain a mystery. And I'd love for you to chime in and tell us who you think it is. I just put up a poll on Twitter at Mind's Eye Show. So just go vote now on that. We're diving into another mystery next week when we talk to Dennis Stone, owner of America's Stonehenge. The question is, for this archaeological site, was it built by Native American culture, a pre-Columbian European civilization, or is it just complete, utter BS? Just like tonight, hear the information first, then decide for yourself. Until then, be well and let well be. Appreciate you listening. Damn sure appreciate you subscribing. And you don't even want to know what I do for a 5-star review. DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for The Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye with BJ Turnoff is available on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, and all major platforms. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing.